At an early point during that first Arab-Israeli war, there was a truce, a 3-week truce. During it, the Arabs didn't receive one bullet or bomb because there was an arms embargo on the region. During it, Israel got all the weapons it needed to defeat the Arabs. When the fighting resumed, it was 90,000 well-armed Israelis against 20,000 poorly armed, badly led, totally dispirited Arab soldiers. That's the truth about 1948. I wonder how many of you know that. In the immediate aftermath of that war, the defeated and discredited Arab regimes secretly shared the same hope as Zionism and the major powers. It was that the Palestine file would remain closed. It had been closed not only by Israel's victory on the battlefield, it had also been closed by Jordan's annexation of the West Bank to prevent the Zionists taking that, and by Egypt's seizure of the Gaza Strip to prevent the Zionists taking that. In the script written by Zionism and endorsed by all the major powers and the Arab regimes, the Palestinians were then supposed to accept their lot as the sacrificial lambs on the altar of political expediency. In that context, it can be said that Yasser Arafat's real crime, by all who demonized him, was that he was the guy who came along and caused the file to be reopened. And since then, it's what I've already described as the incredible steadfastness of the occupied and oppressed Palestinians that have kept the file open. Now, I think it will never again be closed unless Zionism's in Israel leaders resort to a final round of ethnic cleansing. I personally think they will, and you might like to take me up on that in questions. I can write and speak with real authority about the 1967 war because I was in fact the first Western TV correspondent to the banks of the Suez Canal with the advancing Israelis. And I was very well connected to Israel's political and military leadership. The mainly Gentile Judeo or Christian world was conditioned to believe, and largely does still believe, I'm sure that about 98% of Americans do still believe, that Israel went to war in 1967 either because the Arabs started it by attacking Israel, that was Zionism's first story, or because the Arabs were intending to attack, that was Israel's second story. And that in the name of self-defense, Israel had no choice but to launch a preemptive strike. Both those stories are big, fat propaganda lies. The Arabs did not attack and were not intending to attack. It was a war of Israeli choice and aggression. For Israel's hawks, it was the completion of the unfinished business of 1948. Now, if that was only my Gentile view, it could be dismissed by supporters of Israel, right or wrong, as an alleged manifestation of anti-Semitism. But let me now tell you this. The forthcoming volume 3 of my book begins with the longest chapter in the entire work. It's titled America Takes Sides, War with Nasser Act 2, and the Creation of Greater Israel. In this chapter, I name and quote a number of Israel's political and military leaders of the time who, years after the event, in most cases, admitted the truth. There isn't time for me this evening to quote them all, but I'll give you 4 quotes. In an interview published in Le Monde, the French paper, on the 28th of February 1968, Israeli Chief of Staff Rabin said, quote, "I do not believe Nasser wanted war. The 2 divisions which he sent into Sinai on the 14th of May would not have been enough to unleash an offensive against Israel. He knew it and we knew it." Unquote. On the 14th of April 1971, in an Israeli newspaper, there was a statement by Mordecai Bentov, who was a member of the wartime national government. Quote, "The entire story of the danger of extermination was invented in every detail and exaggerated after the events to justify the annexation of Arab territory." Unquote. In the spring of 1972, General Pellet, chief of logistical command during the war, addressed a political literary club in Tel Aviv and said, quote, "The thesis according to which the danger of genocide hung over us in 1967 and according to which Israel was fighting for her very survival was nothing but a bluff which was born and bred after the war." Finally, for now, in 1982, none other than Prime Minister Begin, arguably the most successful terrorist leader the modern world has seen, went even further. He said, quote, "In June 1967, we had a choice. The Egyptian army concentrations in the Sinai approaches did not prove that Nasser was really going to attack us. We must be honest with ourselves. We decided to attack him." Unquote. When I was writing this long chapter on the 1967 war, I found myself saying to readers, and you can read it, there were times, and this was one of them, when I wanted to cry out with the pain of knowing how much Israelis had been deceived and lied to by their own leaders. I think I'll tell you why I was so well informed in my television reporting days about what was happening behind closed doors. One of my sources, my deep throat, was General Chaim Herzog. He was the founding father of Israel's Directorate of Military Intelligence. He went on to become Israel's ambassador to the UN and the state's president. On the second day of the war, when he was advising me on the best route into Sinai to catch up with the Israeli army, he said, quote, "If Nasser had not been stupid enough to give us the pretext to go to war, we would have created one within 18 months or so." Another summary truth, and I bet none of you know this, about what really happened in June 1967, there would not have been a war if Israel's Prime Minister, the much maligned Levi Eshkol, and Chief of Staff Yitzhak Rabin had had their way. After Egypt's President Nasser had closed the Straits of Iran to Israeli shipping, they wanted only a limited military operation to satisfy Israeli public opinion, but most importantly to put pressure on America to lead the international community into delivering on a promise President Eisenhower made, that in the event of Egypt closing the Straits of Iran, the, quote, "Society of Nations," unquote, would be mobilized to cause the Straits to be reopened by diplomatic means. That was what Nasser was hoping would happen. For reasons of faith, which is very important in the Arab world, as some people here will know, he needed to be able to say to the Arab world, "I backed down because of international pressure." So why didn't Prime Minister Eshkol and Chief of Staff Rabin have their way? The short answer is that in Israel, the week before the war, there was what amounted to a military coup in all but name, without a shot being fired.